A Russian man claiming to hold top-level secrets about Russian advanced bombers has just turned up at the U.S. southern border, seeking asylum. The man claims to have been an engineer at a production facility over in the city of Kazan, and he says that he possesses top-secret information about the White Swan Tu-160, which is the most advanced bomber in the Russian arsenal. U.S. border officials, they interviewed the man, and they determined that his story was in fact credible and eventually passed him off to the FBI, who are still in the process of interrogating him right now. However, analysts have pointed out that the fact that the story was even leaked to the public is an indication that perhaps the American government is encouraging other Russians who also hold top-level secrets to also escape to America. And if you thought that was interesting, well then you should click on that button below this video and check out Epic TV, one of the best no-censorship video platforms on the internet.
Forgive about $200 billion in loans under IDR plans over the next 10 years, even before taking into account the Biden administration's changes. About 80% of that forgiven balance is going to go to graduate students. So it's a fairly expensive program already, and it's also going to people who don't necessarily need the help, a lot of people with graduate degrees. The Biden administration is kind of going to take that and just ratchet it up to 11. So you can see on the right panel of that chart there, what the Biden administration is going to do is it's going to raise that exemption of income from 150% of the federal poverty line to 225% of the federal poverty line, so that you will be paying nothing if you make below $33,000 a year for a single person, and that's about the median earnings for somebody with an associate degree. So that's already, you're kind of getting free community college there, because people who are getting the median earnings for somebody with a community college degree are probably going to be paying nothing towards their loans. And then above that threshold, 225% of the federal poverty line, if you have undergraduate loans, you're going to be paying 5% of your income. If you have graduate loans, you're going to be paying 10% of your income. And remaining balances are going to be completely discharged after a period ranging from 10 to 25 years, depending, 1, on how much you borrowed, and 2, on whether you're getting PSLF, public service loan forgiveness, or not. There's also a secondary benefit here, which is interest forgiveness. So if your payment does not cover accrued interest on your loans, the remaining interest is going to be wiped out. So say that your monthly scheduled payment under this new IDR plan is $50 a month, but your accrued interest is $100 a month. That remaining $50 of unpaid interest is going to be wiped out. And a lot of people are going to be getting that benefit because payments are just going to be set so low. So that's, I can give you a little chart here just to show you exactly what that is going to mean for borrowers at different income levels. The media will often describe this new IDR plan as cutting payments in half, and that is the very bare minimum. Most borrowers are going to see their payments cut even more than in half. If you're making below $33,000 a year, your payments are going to be reduced to 0, so that's 100% reduction in payments. And even if you're making, middle-class income, an upper income, you're still going to be seeing your monthly payments reduced by more than half if you have undergraduate loans. So it really is, a fundamental change to the way we're doing student lending. I know Jason and Andrew are going to have more charts to show you exactly, how much of a subsidy this is going to be. But I also just want to give you a sense before I close out here of how much this is going to cost the federal government. So the official Education Department estimate says that this will cost about $138 billion over 10 years. That is almost certainly a massive underestimate, because it assumes that no borrowers who are currently choosing that standard mortgage style plan are going to switch into IDR. It also assumes that colleges aren't going to raise their tuition at all in response to this hugely generous new plan. And it assumes that the Biden student loan forgiveness is going to be upheld by the Supreme Court. Therefore, so fewer people will be choosing IDR because they're getting their loans forgiven. The Congressional Budget Office has come out with an independent estimate, which I think is much more reasonable. They say that if you account for all of that stuff, it's going to cost more like $276 billion. The Penn-Wharton budget model says that if you have more liberal assumptions about how many people are going to use this new IDR plan, it could cost as much as $490 billion. So, you know, a huge range of cost estimates, but they all agree that it's probably going to cost a heck of a lot of money. So with that, I'll give it back to Lindsay.
Great. Thanks, Preston. So Jason, I know you've done a ton of analysis on what the numbers actually look like when you dig into them, what this means for borrowers, particularly by income. Preston alluded to this, so can you walk us through those numbers and scenarios?
Yeah, so I think a major point here is that we've had an income-driven repayment option in the federal student loan program for quite some time, a broad-based one since at least about 2009. But the idea around that plan, if you look at the way people talked about it and the impetus for it and the motivation for creating that plan, is that it was supposed to be sort of a safety net. And I think it largely was that. There are some flaws, there's some ways to improve on that, but I think what the Biden administration is doing, and what you'll see in some of my slides here with this change, is it's changing the program from a safety net to one that's sort of broadly subsidizing higher education through loan forgiveness. And so it's a major policy change. I don't think the higher education community, I don't think the policy community has really wrestled with what that means. One implication is, I think we're going to be in a situation once this takes effect of having to encourage people to take student loans. We've been in a culture of loans are bad, but now if you stand to have a lot of it forgiven, even if you're making the income you expected to make after getting out of school, well, now we have this strange dilemma of encouraging people to take loans. So at the Urban Institute, when this policy was announced at the Biden administration's new loan plan, we had 30 days to look at it and then submit comments. And then the books were closed on public comments for the administration's proposal. So we did the best analysis we could in the 15 days that we had to actually get it all done and get it out. And this here is the conclusion of the paper. You can go to the Urban Institute site and look at it. The conclusion is, once these changes go into effect, few college students will repay their student loans. What we did is, and the main effect here is for undergraduates. I will show you later on how the graduate students are actually largely unaffected by these changes. They still benefit heavily from income-driven repayment, but there isn't a big increase in benefit for them in the plan. In fact, there may be actually a reduction. So big change here targeted on undergrads. And what we did is we looked at some data about what undergraduates earn when they get out of school using a data set from the Department of Education. And we assumed if they borrow the typical amount for them, not necessarily what they did borrow, but if they were to borrow the typical amount, how much would they repay? And we broke it down here in between to certificates and associate's degrees, and this is the share that they would repay, the share of the debt repaid. And then also bachelor's degrees. You can see under current IDR, an associate's or certificate degree student, most of them, about 62%, will fully repay the loan. Under the Biden administration's change, we estimate that only 11% will fully repay their loan. We think the majority of those students will receive some loan forgiveness under income-driven repayment. So essentially, loan forgiveness will become the norm for these students. For bachelor's degree students, for graduates, 60% would fully repay their loans. Now we would expect only 22%. So the typical bachelor's degree recipient will have at least some of their loan forgiven. Now I'm going to run through a couple of quick examples of individual borrowers. This is sort of a distribution of all undergraduates, but let's take some individual examples that we've run some analyses on at the Urban Institute. So let's look at undergraduates. Let's take an undergraduate with $30,000 in debt and a starting income of $50,000. This is not atypical, right? For someone who gets a bachelor's degree, this is kind of what we would expect the outcome to be when they leave school. You can see on the left-hand side under current IDR, they borrow 30, they repay about $40,000, $41,000. I'm not discounting this for time, right? And they have none forgiven, they fully repay. Under the Biden plan, this borrower would have about $20,000 forgiven because the payments are so low. I'll run through a couple more examples. If we do debt of $12,000, income of $40,000, So we've lowered the income a little bit here. Still no loan forgiveness under current IDR. Under the Biden plan, they're only going to pay about $6,000 of this $12,000 loan. And they're going to have $11,000 forgiven. Now, here's someone who might maybe say they dropped out of community college, maybe. So they just have $5,000 in debt, and their income is $25,000 a year. They don't make a single payment under the Biden plan, and they have $7,500 in principal and interest forgiven. So they don't need to pay because their income isn't above this threshold that Preston talked about. So let me show you some graduate examples really quickly to wrap up. Remember how I said graduate borrowers are not really affected, and this is because they don't qualify for the lower share of their income towards their payment. So here's someone with $80,000 in debt, starting income of $65,000. These are basically the same, right, under current IDR and the Biden administration. And one of the reasons here, too, is that under the Biden administration's plan, you have to pay for 25 years before you get your loans forgiven if it's a graduate loan. That's an extension. The current policy is 20. Now, my last slide here is the place where graduate students will benefit from the Biden administration proposal plan is under public service loan forgiveness. Under public service loan forgiveness, if you use income-driven repayment, you pay for 10 years, you have any remaining debt forgiven. So graduate borrowers are going to make lower payments under income-driven repayment. They get this larger exemption, this 225% of poverty, but they're still going to get their loans forgiven after 10 years. So this is a little wild. This one takes, so this is someone who gets public service loan forgiveness. You can see how generous current IDR is already under public service loan forgiveness for someone with graduate debt. They would have about $56,000 of this debt forgiven. Under the Biden plan, that jumps to about $72,000 under public service, again, because they're going to make lower payments and they don't have a longer time frame. So really the big action here is on the undergraduate side, and I think the message here is that given the extent of loan forgiveness and the amount this reduces how much people are going to pay, we're sort of moving to a system of broad subsidies through income-driven repayment.
That last chart is breathtaking and maddening. Andrew, so I know you've done just as much modeling. Can you tell us a little bit about how this varies by level of degree that a student pursues, a borrower pursues?
Yeah, so the impact by degree really depends on which of the changes is going to affect those students the most. And so remember, Preston talked about really three main changes. So we're shortening the share of income that students have to repay for at least some portion of students. We're shortening the length of time they have to repay, and we're also exempting more income from having to make any payments. So if you get all three of those, you're going to get like an exponential increase in generosity of this plan. If you're only getting one of them, you get kind of a slight increase in generosity. So the impact on students depends on how many of those three boxes they check. And so this first chart. So this is just kind of making a point. So I've keyed in on two of the changes. First, the income exemption, and you can see that along the bottom axis. And you can see that over time, as we've introduced new income-driven repayment plans, we've gotten more and more generous over time. So we're moving further and further away from the origin on that x-axis, and that means that more and more income is kind of shielded from any repayment whatsoever. At the same time, over time, we're flattening the slope of those lines. So of the remaining income that we are paying, we're paying even less. So if you look at the far side, so the $80,000 of income, look at what those students are paying under the Biden plan. I think that's $250. I can't see it from here. I think it's about $250. Under the original income-driven repayment plan, which is called income contingent repayment, introduced in 1994, they were paying, I believe, over $1,000. So this is kind of a massive change, depending on how many of those boxes you check. So this chart here just basically shows you the change in a student's first payment, that first month's payment under these various plans. And you can see that for the associate's degree students, they're really seeing their payments reduced, and most of that is coming because of the income exemption amount. So changing from 150% of the poverty line to 225%. Bachelor's degree, you still see a dip. Master's degree, you see a dip. But when you go to professional degree, the change there is really going to be driven by the forgiveness provisions. and kind of the interaction of all those. And you can see this even more clearly in this chart here. So this is kind of, if you follow the Congressional Budget Office, this is based on how the Congressional Budget Office would consider subsidy rates. And so for associate's degrees, we're taking a loan that the CBO considers technically makes the government a profit under any of the existing income-driven repayment plans. And now governments are going to make a massive loss on those loans. The same thing happens with professional degrees. Interestingly, the opposite happens with master's degrees. So master's degrees are actually going to make the government more of a profit than was the case before. And we'll see the reason for that in these next couple of slides. So in these next slides, I'm showing kind of three panels here. So the top panel is just monthly payment under the different repayment plans. Second panel, the middle panel, is the present value of all the cumulative payments to date as a percent of the original loan. So if you go above 100%, that means that the government considers that it's making a profit on that loan. And then the bottom panel is just kind of the loan balance. And so this first chart is for a bachelor's degree in fine and studio arts. And what we can see is that the payments vary quite a bit. So if you're standard loan payment or income-driven repayment, basically your kind of payments will increase until you reach the standard payment amount. And all those existing income-driven repayment plans, the government actually, you pay off your loan, the government makes a profit. But that changes with the Biden IDR program. Under the Biden IDR, this student will not pay a dime of their principal. They'll still pay a lot of interest, but the government will actually make a considerable loss on that. Now compare that to these charts, which is for a bachelor's in nursing degree. These students pay off their loans completely, and because they pay for slightly longer under the Biden plan, the government actually will make more of a profit on bachelor's in nursing degrees under these. And then last one I want to look at is, so this is a professional degree in law. So we go from a situation where the students pay off their loans under the standard repayment plan or under income-driven repayment. They don't repay it under repay, and they don't repay it under the Biden plan. But under repay, interestingly, the government will still make a profit on these loans because the student will pay so much interest over time. That is no longer the case under the Biden plan. So this is basically a subsidy for law school students as well.
Thanks, Andrew. So, Paul, these are significant changes. Is it a fait accompli? What's the legal situation, the challenges? Can you walk through what the court, the oral arguments in February, and what that means for IDR potentially?
Sure, Lindsay, and thanks so much for hosting us. Thanks to the Heritage Foundation. So on the current legal challenges in the Supreme Court, on the mass student loan forgiveness, I would just say, based on the oral arguments, that it looked like a clear majority of the court was skeptical of the president's power to unilaterally cancel student loans under the HEROES Act. I think that Justice Barrett had a few questions and a few doubts on the standing of the states based on the student loan servicer, Mohila, which was not actually in court. But I did not hear from the five justices in the conservative wing of the court really too much skepticism on the standing issue, and really they were focused on the merits, which means to me I think there's a good chance that in June the mass student loan cancellation program will be struck down. So what does that leave in its wake? Well, I think basically you're moving out a wolf that's dressed like a wolf, which is the mass student loan forgiveness program, which is kind of a political payout to voters. And then you're putting in place a wolf dressed as a sheep, which is this untargeted grant program that is dressed up as a repayment program under income-driven repayment. And so what are the potential legal avenues for challenging IDR under the Biden administration's proposal? Well, I think I just talk about, in the interest of time, one major challenge, which is under the major questions doctrine as formulated by the Supreme Court in West Virginia versus EPA. It's a separation of powers principle. Under it, the court requires that if an agency is going to regulate on a matter of vast economic and political significance, that it point to clear congressional authorization under a statute to do so. I think that there's no question, based on what we've just heard, that this is a matter of vast economic and political significance. The economic significance in the hundreds of billions of dollars in admitted cost of this plan. In terms of political significance, I think they're really taking an issue away from Congress that is very, very widely being debated in Congress right now through numerous proposals, and the executive is attempting to unilaterally regulate on this issue. But also, it's going to reorganize incentives of borrowers across the country, and it's really going to reorganize the financing of higher education. So once you get past the significance hurdle, I think things become a little bit trickier for people challenging this statute, because when you look at challenging this rule, excuse me, because when you look at this statute giving the authorization to the Department of Education to formulate these rules, it's very broad, and I think we'll hear a little bit more on that. But it's very broad authority that gives the Secretary the power to craft income-driven repayment plans, income-contingent repayment plans, with the only real guardrail being maximum repayment period of 25 years. So I think the Secretary can point to that statute, say, look, I have all the authorization I need. And I think really where a challenger is going to have to be successful is saying, look, this is a difference in not just in degree from other past repayment plans. This is unprecedented. This is a difference in kind. And Congress never envisioned this in the early 1990s when it gave the Secretary and the Department this power to craft income-contingent repayment plans, that this would be turned into a grant program, an untargeted grant program. So I think that it's going to be an uphill battle, potentially. It's not going to be as strong of a case as the case against mass student loan debt cancellation. I think that there are other viable challenges, and there are standing issues that I think we'll get to. But really, it might be an area where I think Congress is really going to have to step up to the plate, and it's really going to have to consider limiting the Secretary's discretion under this program.
Thanks, Paul. I love it when lawyers can translate things into plain English, so well done. So we're going to do a quick little lightning round, max 2 minutes each. And Preston, so Paul just now said this is going to reorganize incentives for borrowers. So can you talk a little bit potentially about the impact long-term on the price of college, and then maybe some of the moral hazard issues that are implicit in this?
Of course, yeah. So as Jason's chart showed, most borrowers are going to be getting some forgiveness under this new income-driven repayment plan. And that means for 80% of borrowers, if you do not borrow the maximum amount from the federal government, you are leaving money on the table. So that really changes the incentives for borrowers. Right now, believe it or not, about 45% of college students do not borrow, and that proportion is closer to 75%, 80% at community colleges. But now, if you're not borrowing, you are leaving money on the table. And so what incentives does that create for colleges? Suddenly, students are leaving money on the table if they don't borrow. That means that colleges are going to find it easier to raise tuition in order to capture these new loan dollars from the federal government, which are then going to be forgiven. It's basically this kind of crazy Rube Goldberg machine subsidy, but it really is, offering what is essentially free college through the back door. And so I really worry, as Lindsay said, about the moral hazard implications of this, that if colleges are able to raise tuition to capture this additional dollars, they're not going to be liable for the outcomes that students are experiencing after the fact. That we could be in a very bad situation where the government is essentially subsidizing pretty much the entire cost of some degrees that are simply costing too much and not delivering enough. And I think if we're going to fix this, we need to really, take a step back and think about what are student loans supposed to be for. Student loans are supposed to be a tool for investment. They're supposed to be a loan you take out, make an investment in education in order to increase your earnings capacity over the long term. And so what we really need to do is to say to colleges, if you want to benefit from this student loan program that the federal government is offering, you need to make sure that that investment is actually paying off. You need to make sure that students are getting an increase in earnings that is enough to fully repay their loans with interest. And if not, then perhaps you shouldn't be getting unfettered access to the federal student loan program anymore. And until we have colleges take at least some responsibility for those outcomes, we're just going to keep repeating this crisis that we have.
Hear, hear. So Jason, lessons learned. Is the Biden administration really to blame, or is it Congress's fault? Did they plant the seeds?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, Paul alluded to this, and he did a good job of explaining it. And I'll just sort of reiterate, like, this plan, this income-driven repayment plan that the Biden administration is implementing, they are pointing to existing statute that pretty clearly says and it is wildly open-ended. It was written it's in the 1993 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Congress wanted the Department of Education to design an income-driven repayment plan, and they put no parameters on it whatsoever, other than loan forgiveness shall not occur any later than 25 years. So it can occur as soon as you would like it to occur. I mean, there's nothing in the statute to prevent them from forgiving the loans after 1 month of payments, really. And so, I mean, there's a lot of blame here on Congress for writing a very open-ended law. I think, having gone back and looked at some of the hearing transcripts that led to the creation of that particular statute, the thinking at the time was that the secretary would design a plan that was sort of budget neutral and would cross-subsidize, where some people pay less, some people pay more. And in fact, the Clinton administration at the time, when asked in a hearing before the Senate Help Committee, how much would something like this cost if we gave you this authority? And the Clinton administration official testifying said, we view it as a wash. Yep, there you have it, right? So Congress said, oh, okay, I guess no one would abuse this if they're intending that it wouldn't cost anything. Might as well write it open-ended. And so that's how we have this situation. But I think one other observation on this is I keep thinking about in terms of like sort of lessons learned here and things coming down the pike. Right? We have a problem of sort of resentment around student debt in this country. I think that there's a chance that gets worse based on something that Andrew said, right? Where we saw how someone pursuing a degree where their earnings are going to be low, they don't have to pay off the loan. They get it entirely forgiven. But the nurse who has good earnings and is pursuing a career that's going to pay off has to fully repay the loan. I mean, that's not a system that is necessarily going to make people sort of support the student loans, look at them any more favorably. I think it might create more resentment.
Mm-hmm. Especially on the part of nurses and engineers, and we had an op-ed on that question not that long ago. Andrew, so let me caveat this by saying, we know, yes, that outstanding aggregate student loan debt is high, right? Everybody knows the $1.7 trillion figure that's out there, whatever it's up to now. But the median monthly loan repayment for individuals is fairly modest, $222 a month. Last I checked was the median monthly payment. So just a little caveat before I ask you this question about, yes, we have a price problem in higher ed. College costs are increasing. So how do we bring accountability to higher ed pricing? If not, obviously, the Biden administration plan, what can be done?
Yeah, that's a great question. The thing I really worry about with student aid in general, but particularly the student loan programs, is setting up systems that are kind of win-win-win so win for the student, win for the government, win for the college. And right now, the student loans don't do that. So you can have a lot of programs out there where the school is the only winner because they get all their tuition money up front and they get to keep that, regardless of if the student defaults and regardless of if the government gets paid back. And so that to me is a broken system. That's not something that we should try to preserve and kind of strengthen. So the question is, okay, how do we get to a win-win-win where it's only in the school's interest to offer programs that are wins for the student, meaning the student can afford to repay their student loans comfortably, and where the government actually gets repaid. And so there's a couple of different ways of doing that. One is kind of what I think of as accountability, which is the government kind of coming in and saying, okay, we're going to establish some accountability thresholds and metrics where we are not going to allow this type of education to be provided. And you can do it at the program level. So you can say, okay, it seems like at this particular school, everybody who gets a bachelor's degree in fine and studio arts defaults. We're not going to let that program participate in the student loan program anymore. So you can do it kind of performance-based like that. The other way you could do this is with a risk-sharing proposal. So just pass it off to the school. Say, okay, we've got all these kind of safety nets for students. Right now, the government's paying that tab. Let's have the school pay it. And if the school still wants to offer that program, that's fine. They're going to be on the hook if the government doesn't repay that. And so I think those are the two ways you can switch from a system that's kind of lose-lose-win to win-win-win.
That's great, thanks. Paul, just to wrap us up before we open it up to everybody's questions here and online as well. So you mentioned on the merits, right, major questions doctrine. This sounds maybe not like a slam dunk, but pretty solid on the merits, right, that this violates the major questions doctrine, that this is something that Congress clearly hasn't delegated to the executive. But what about standing? I mean, this is the big outstanding issue right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see in the Supreme Court case that the biggest obstacle to a favorable victory for the plaintiffs is standing at this point, it seems like. And so I would say that in order to prove standing, you have to prove an injury. When the government is directing a fire hose of money on spraying money on colleges and on student loan borrowers, it's a little hard to prove an injury beyond like a broad taxpayer injury. So I would say a couple of things about standing. I think states could try to establish standing by claiming that by refusing to charge interest, the Biden administration is depriving them of tax revenue when they tax forgiven student loans. They're losing out on that revenue that would have constituted the interest. But let's not forget that this is a huge student loan forgiveness statute, basically. You get your student loan forgiven after 10 years in many circumstances. So I think states will experience a windfall in terms of tax revenue based on the forgiveness that'll happen under this rule. I think student loan servicers or states on their behalf are going to struggle to establish standing or establish an injury because they're going to get so much more business from under the IDR plan. People who ordinarily would not have funded their college educations through student loans would be leaving money on the table, as we heard. So it would be hard for student loan servicers to say that all of this business is actually an injury. I think this is, again, I keep on putting Congress and houses of Congress on the spot. This could be a place where Congress or a House of Congress might have to step in the litigation context, say, executive branch, you're acting beyond the scope of your authority based on the major questions doctrine or based on its appropriations authority, where obviously the executive branch can't write checks that were never authorized by Congress. So that might be another area where Congress has to play a role.
There's hope. Great. Thanks. Well, we want to open it up to your questions and any questions we have online. If you have a question, raise your hand. We have a mic that will come around to you. Or if no brave souls, we'll take a, okay, we've got one in the front. Bobby, down in the front here. Oh, perfect.
Hey there, Steve Taylor with Stand Together Trust. So Jason, you talked about in the 90s, we had a Clinton administration official talk about this being a cost-neutral intent. Paul, as you think about any legal strategy, does that play into sort of the intent behind the program and how the current administration is exceeding that authority that, exceeding the initial intent created under that statute?
Absolutely. I think that is going to be strong evidence that Congress never intended to create a program that was not, revenue neutral. That it never intended to create a program that was so generous that it effectively behaved as an untargeted grant program. I think this practice of agencies using statutes that have existed for a long time to fulfill their political priorities and campaign promises is something that the Supreme Court is scrutinizing in the past few years. And I think it's signaled that it's going to take a very close look at what the statute originally meant. I think that's true in a lot of contexts, and I think it's definitely true in the Higher Education Act context.
Great. Other questions here?
I mean, I would just add to that, though, that, I mean, you can go, if you go and read the statute, you can look up the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993 and search for income contingent repayment, and it will bring you to the very short statute, the very few lines. And I mean, it's very open-ended. It's just that the payment plan has to be based on the borrower's income, and it doesn't say how much of their income. Paul and I were talking, though, but before this about, it's interesting. I mean, they sort of suppose the Biden administration had, because I believe they, at least if you read the statute, it looks like they could have done this, that they could have provided the loan forgiveness after 1 year of payment and on 1% of their income. I mean, and I have to sort of like imagine like what might have happened if that's the approach they took. I think people might say, well, that's crazy. I mean, well, it's just sort of, I mean, I showed you some of these charts. I mean, this is fairly aggressive what they're doing now and a very major change. So I wonder if that might have gotten someone's attention. There might have been more political pushback, but again, I still think the statute seems to suggest that they could do that. So again, I go back to like sort of saying, the lesson for Congress is write tighter laws.
Great. Any online?
Yeah, we had some sent in. Here's one. How reversible are the changes in forgiveness terms? Suppose that the next administration wants to go back to the old repayment requirements. Could the new administration do that, or would that constitute a taking?
I guess, yeah. I don't think that it would constitute any constitutional issue to go back and reformulate the loan terms the way that they currently are. So I certainly do think that future administration could do that, and I think that raises another problem with this proposed rule. And it's this kind of I'm gonna borrow a phrase from one of my colleagues, executive ping pong between administrations, just bouncing back and forth. People don't know what to predict, based on what the previous administration does. So I think really borrowers are put in this position where, if a court strikes this down, or if the next administration overturns this, what position am I going to be in? And it's going to be very difficult to do any long-term planning, unfortunately, based on these rules.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think it would be difficult for a future administration to reverse it for borrowers who have already enrolled in that income in the new income-based repayment plan, because I think they would quite credibly say, I borrowed loans under the expectation that this super generous repayment plan would be available to me, and you can't then just take it away. If that's not a legal issue, it's certainly a big political issue. I think it would be easier to end the new, more generous income-driven repayment plan for new borrowers as of 2025 or whenever the new president takes office. But then you face the issue where if you still have this very open-ended statutory authority, 4 years later, the next president comes into office, they could just go back to the go back again to the very generous Biden version of income-driven repayment. And so you do have this ping pong, but it's an asymmetrical ping pong in which you can always make it more generous for current borrowers, but it's very difficult to then claw back those benefits for current borrowers.
The one wild card still out there is the taxation of the forgiven amount at the end. So until this administration, if you got your loans forgiven, that was considered taxable income. And that would usually jump you up into a pretty high tax bracket. And so the current administration has gotten rid of that until 2025. So the next administration or whatever could basically say, okay, we're going to re-implement the taxation of the forgiveness, and also you don't get the forgiveness until you pay the tax. Because that's going to be a huge burden. That could be like a third or even a fourth or 40% of the total amount forgiven, which is going to be hard for a lot of students to come up with if they were qualifying for this plan.
Which, correct me if I'm wrong, they did the taxation piece before these changes.
That is correct. Yeah. It was part of one of the coronavirus bills.
They knew what they were doing. Yeah. Jason.
Well, one of the things that's interesting here is that, a lot of the debt that you would get forgiven under the old plans would be unpaid accrued interest. But now the unpaid accrued interest each month is now being canceled each month. And what I think is interesting there is that that's not considered taxable income, even when the statute goes back to...
That is interesting.
It is, you're right.
What do you think about that?
I once asked somebody at the Department of Education, why is that not considered taxable income when you have the interest forgiven? And they said, well, we're interpreting the statute in a way that the secretary never charges the interest, so it's never.
Yeah,
you do that.
And I would just say I don't think that that is another definite basis for challenge of this rule, is that I don't think that anything in the statute gives the secretary or the department the authority just to refuse to charge interest. Now, they can always point to the text of the statute and just say, this gives us the power to do whatever we want. But in that case, I think that we have some non-delegation concerns. There's no intelligible principle for the department to operate under. So I think that's another very potential legal challenge. The statute actually requires any accrued interest to be included, in a borrower's balance. So I think that's a strong potential challenge.
And quickly, before I turn back to the questions, so the pause on repayments, Jason, you made me think about that. So this costs $5 billion a month, right? That will, and Paul, depending on how the court holds what they hold ultimately on forgiveness, that's going to impact repayment when that kicks off, et cetera, right?
I believe that's right. But I think it's 60 days after that Supreme Court decision.
Yeah.
Right, and I don't think this plan will be available to borrowers quite that soon. We're also talking here as if this plan is sort of locked in. The administration has not yet released their final version. They released a version, and then they did their 30 days comment period, and now I think they're reading the 30,000 comments, and then they're still free to make changes to it before they put it in place.
Is that what they got? 30,000?
I think it was something on that.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So setting aside.
Oh, actually, could you wait on the mic? I'm sorry for our online viewers.
Can you hear me? That's good. Okay. So setting aside, if we're in a world where accountability couldn't happen, risk sharing couldn't happen, loan limits couldn't happen, which would be unfortunate. How could you design, what kind of repayment system, if you could only change IDR, how could you design that to be a win-win-win, as you put it, or whether that's setting the forgiveness terms, whether that's, monthly payments, how would you all kind of design a system that would kind of create better incentives and reduce costs for taxpayers?
And to be clear, you're ruling out accountability, risk sharing, changing them.
Are there changes to IDR that you could do that would be?
Those are my three go-tos. So one thing you could do is you say, okay, the statute says forgiveness has to happen by 25 years. So you said 25 years is the forgiveness date. You then calculate the percent of income owed that is necessary to fully repay by 25 years. And so you could have a differential repayment rate, or basically income share, by essentially income and debt levels by program.
I think one of the biggest issues with IDR is that basically how much you pay bears no relationship to how much you borrow if you're getting forgiveness. So I think that if you're ruling out all those options, the best option would be to modify IDR in some way such that your payments are at least somewhat linked to your balance. So say maybe like Jeb Bush proposed way back in the day, 1% for every of income for every 10,000 you borrow, or something like that, just so that there is some cost discipline there to say that, okay, there is some disincentive to borrowing more, and for the college, there is some disincentive to charging more.
I would say, so, the answer to that is, so the administration is they're moving 4 things in this plan. I think Andrew alluded to this, that any one of them is a big change, and they're doing 4, right? They're reducing the amount, or they're increasing the amount of income that is exempt from the payment calculation. They're reducing the share of your income that you have to pay. They're canceling any unpaid interest each month. And then they're increasing the time to loan forgiveness to as early as 10 years. I think if you did just 2 of any of the 4, you would have something that looked, I would say, more rational. So I think the issue is that they're doing all 4 of those things. You really can just pick any 2, whichever 2 you'd like, and you think are the most important, and I think that gets you to a much more rational and targeted program.
When they took those 4 levels and they moved them to the most generous settings ever in history, all of them simultaneously. In actuality, if you make one more generous, you can make another more stringent, and that'll help offset the budgetary impact. So if you want to forgive interest, okay, increase payments. If you want to exempt more income, okay, and don't forgive interest. That kind of stuff.
Right. This is what the UK did. UK has income-driven repayment as well, and a few years back they reduced the amount that you have to pay, the share of your income. But then they increase loan forgiveness to something like 35 or 40 years. That's what they're doing. 35, 40 years for loan forgiveness in their plan. We're going the other direction.
Good on the Brits. We'll do another online question.
Sure. Does the proposed forgiveness program apply to Graduate Plus and Parent Plus? On behalf of the taxpayer, shouldn't unlimited borrowing Graduate Plus programs be canceled?
Yes, just in the Grad Plus program. Carry on.
So I believe Grad Plus is included in this. Parent Plus is not. Is that everybody's
correct,
understanding? Yeah. And then in terms of, I'm a big fan of kind of getting rid of the Plus program entirely. So for Parent Plus, there's kind of like a very under-acknowledged story that the default rates on that are atrocious. Because like think about it, if you are financially sound, you can get a much better loan term doing like a home equity line of credit to pay for your kid's college. So the parents who can't do that are taking out a lot of Parent Plus loans, but those are exactly the parents that can't afford really large loans. So Parent Plus is kind of scandalous, and it's ignored a lot. Grad Plus, my main problem with it is that it's uncapped, which I'm not allowed to lower the cap. So if you capped it at a reasonable level, it would function a lot more like the undergraduate loans.
How about 0?
Yeah. Great choice.
But I'll add here that the Biden administration's change here, that if you're going to use this new plan with the graduate loan, you can't get loan forgiveness until 25 years. Currently it's 20. And that, I mean, in running the numbers, that makes a pretty big difference. Their payments are lower under this plan. But that seems to be, in the data, that seems to be pretty well offset by the fact that they have to pay for 5 more years.
Yes, praise for the Biden administration on this.
I mean, I have to, I mean, they clearly did take some steps to reduce the increase in benefits for graduate students. So, I mean, have to give them credit for that, as hard as it is.
I do want to mention, though, that if graduate students so choose, they can still use one of the current IBR plans, new income-based repayment, IBR, rather than IDR, which will give them access to the 20-year loan forgiveness. The fact is they won't get the 225% of poverty exemption, so if you're a grad student, you'll have to get your spreadsheet out and figure out which one of those is better for you, but you do still have access to the to the 20-year loan forgiveness.
So first, do no harm.
Yeah,
no harm,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yes, sir.
Okay, speaking of which is a preface to the whole incentive for providing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Could you wait on the mic? I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. As a preface to the incentive for providing these opportunities for so many more people, what objectives are we reaching, and how do you prove that they have been actually benefited the general public?
Great question. How are we measuring all of this?
Well, I think we should think about higher education as we want higher education to fulfill an educational Hippocratic oath, which is that it should leave you no worse off financially than you would have been if you hadn't gone to college. It doesn't have to make you rich all the time, but I do think that college shouldn't bring you behind financially. But unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's doing that. So there's a lot of evidence showing, if you start college but don't finish, you're often worse off than if you hadn't gone at all. There's some majors where you're earning less than a high school graduate would. So I think we do need to, it's difficult to measure. I do have a paper trying to measure this and trying to say, what is the actual return on investment associated with each degree and certificate, which you can check out at freeup.org if you want. But, I think we do need to say to colleges, if you want access to these federal aid programs, you have to meet that very basic standard of not leaving your students any worse off than they would have been if they hadn't gone to college at all.
Great. Other questions in the room? Other online questions, Bobby?
Sure. Has anyone proposed a compromise of generous income-driven payment plans in exchange for getting the Department of Education out of the student loan business permanently?
Your terms are acceptable.
So, it's a good question, right? If we're blue skying here, what are the prospects for eventually winding down the federal student loan program in the main? Is that something we could hope for 10, 20 years from now, or are we in this forever where we've got, I think you said, a fire hose of money. I think Rich Vedder used to say dumping money out of airplanes onto universities from the federal level. So how do we extricate ourselves from this situation?
Go ahead. I think that student loans, for the most part, so I don't think that the federal student loan program is ending anytime soon. And the reason for that, I think with these changes to the mass loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment, I think that has some people who maybe were on the fence about that saying, maybe this isn't a great approach. But for the most part, loans, offer a lot of college access in terms of buying power for people to go. And generally, people pay them back. And so I think this is why countries all around the world, not just the US, have said, hey, student loans are a decent way to finance access to higher education. And I think, I don't think that there's a lot of political support for putting something in place instead of the loan program that buys you the same amount of college access. I don't think there's political support for coming up with something that does that. So we're left with student loans.
Other than the free market, yeah.
So there's a great book by a Wall Street Journal reporter, Josh Mitchell, called The Debt Trap, I believe. And he basically walks through the history, the student loan programs. And back in the 60s, government accounting basically counted a loan going out, but not the payments coming in. So it made loans look very expensive for the government to make. So as a result, when they designed the student loan programs in the 60s, they had private lenders do the lending. So it was kind of off the government books. Fast forward to the 90s, Congress then kind of updates the way they do government accounting, and now student loans look profitable. Lo and behold, the government starts making loans. If Biden is successful with this plan, governments are going to look costly to the government again. And so my prediction is that within 10 years or so, we're then going to see the government be out of the student loan business. So if Biden is successful in implementing this plan, I think it'll actually be just a temporary victory, because it'll basically set up the conditions for any kind of reconciliation bill that's looking for money or anything to say, okay, well, if we got the government out of student lending, that would save the government a ton of money.
I think that is such an optimistic note to end on. Well, great. Unless Paul or Preston, if y'all have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I want to add to this discussion that the federal government is actually not very good at being a bank. One of the ways that this new IDR plan came into existence is that a lot of students had felt betrayed by just the administration of student loans in the past. So for instance, they were trying to get forgiveness under the old IDR plans, but the servicers weren't counting their payments right, and there was all this paperwork and blah, 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 blah. And so part of the reason that the Biden administration introduced this super generous new plan is to say we want to make this right, because we recognize that the federal government is absolutely terrible at running a student loan program. And so that's something that I think we need to keep in mind, is that I think theoretically, yes, there is a place for federal student lending in terms of and expanding access to college, solving a credit market failure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we do need to be mindful of the fact that there's government failure in addition to market failure, and that the federal government might not just be able to run this to our satisfaction.
That's great. Well, I know you've all memorized all the numbers that you heard today, but just in case you didn't, this will be online in perpetuity within 24 hours, give or take, so you'll have access to all of their PowerPoint presentations, et cetera. But please join me in thanking our panelists.